I will be doing my revised speech on my informative speech that I did about the Detroit Red Wings. I will be covering the team's early history, drafting of Steve Yzerman, and the later success that the team would find in the modern era through drafting. So, for early history, the team in 1926 was originally in Windsor, Canada, known as the Cougars. They would later move to Detroit, known as the Detroit Falcons. The team had very little success, and new ownership, James Norris, decided to rebrand the team with the iconic wing and wheel based on the history of Detroit and being known as the Motor City. By the year 1936, the team had become the top team in the league, winning the Cup in 1936 and the following year, 1937. By the 50s, the Detroit Red Wings had stars on their team such as Gordie Howe, Ted Lindsay, Kelly, and Sawchuk. During the 50s, the tradition of throwing the octopus on the ice had been born. The symbolic reasoning of this was because back in the day, when there was only 6 teams in the league, it only took 8 games to win the Stanley Cup, and this was the symbol of that with the eight legs of the octopus. This has since become somewhat of a logo of the team and a tradition born in the playoffs. The Detroit Red Wings found a lot of success through the 1950s. They would go on to win the Cup in 1950, 52, and 54, and the following year again in 1955. By the year 1967, the NHL had decided to add 6 more teams called the Second Six. This would be the spawn of the era of the Dead Wings, when the Detroit Red Wings had found little success following those 4 Stanley Cups in the decade of the 50s. There was, as cited in New York Times article, the Dead Wings era was burdened by the coach Ned Harkness, and this era in the 1970s was known as the Darkness of Harkness. Ned Harkness was a very successful NCAA coach. He was, by wins to loss ratio, he was the best all time at the time in the NCAA. But unfortunately for the Red Wings, the team, his winning success did not transfer into the NHL. His team was built up of a lot of old school veterans who did not buy into him as a coach and the ideals he played by. Um, he he had Gordie Howe on the team, who was at the time the best player in the NHL, and he wanted to run the offense solely through him, which broke up a lot of chemistry throughout the team. At the time, Gordie Howe, being the best player in the league, had won 4 Stanley Cups, 6 MVPs, and had been to the finals 11 times in his career. By the time of 1974, Ned Harkness was forcefully required to resign, and Little Caesars Pizza owner Mike Ilitch bought the team in 1982. By the year of 1983, the team went on to draft Steve Yzerman with the 4th overall pick, thus spawning the new generation of the Detroit Red Wings. The following year, after the drafting of Steve Yzerman, the team would go on to make it into the playoffs. And the following year after that, but after making the playoffs for 2 consecutive years, they would go on to become the worst team in the league, only totaling 42 total points on the season. This was a huge step back to the team after the thought success of drafting Steve Yzerman had improved the team. Later on, the team would go on to acquire the 5 Russian players known as the Russian Five. The Russian Five consisted of Larionov, Fedorov, Kozlov, and Konstantinov. This would lead to a birth of massive success in the 1990s, which also added, in the previous year, 1989, the addition of Nick Lidstrom, one of the greatest defensemen of all time. They would go on to be the building blocks of the Detroit Red Wings. The Detroit Red Wings would go on to win the Stanley Cup in 1997 and 1998, and then again in 2002. In 2002, the Detroit Red Wings acquired Dominik Hasek, Brett Hull, and Brendan Shanahan to add on to these star players they already acquired. Today's era existed in the previous years before the 2010s, consists of players like Pavel Datsyuk, Henrik Zetterberg, who were drafted late in the draft, which is where Detroit Red Wings had found a lot of success in the draft, or in the building their team late in the draft, and they continued to build their dynasty on such ideals. They would go on again to win the Stanley Cup in 2008 and go to the Stanley Cup Finals again in 2009, only to fall short. In conclusion, the history of the Detroit Red Wings may have a lot of ups and downs, but their team has always stayed strong and their fan base has always stayed loyal. The team has found a lot of success in building through the draft and building for the modern dynasty that has stayed relevant today, and is a modern example of what franchises want to build in today's standards.